Mr. Blair, I'm Rob Kittredge, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and we share standing at these hearings with the Democracy Fund and Citizens for Freedom. You understand that in order to declare a public order emergency pursuant to the Emergencies Act, there must be a threat to the security of Canada, as that term is defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, right?
Yes.
And I guess let's put that definition up on the screen, please, just for reference. COM 935, Section 2. Are you familiar with the Section 2 CSIS Act definition of a threat to the security of Canada?
Yes.
CSIS themselves advised Cabinet that the protests didn't pose a Section 2 CSIS Act threat. You were aware of their assessment, weren't you?
But I think context is really important, sir.
Sure.
The advice that I understood from CSIS is that it did not meet the CSIS threshold for them to enable them to initiate an investigation, and they were very clear about that. But for the purposes of the Emergencies Act, that definition, I believe, has a broader application that is contained within that definition, and it really the violence and the threat of violence. I believe very clearly the threat of violence. I also believe that the threat of violence existed, and I also believe that the threshold for in that definition is different for the Emergencies Act than it was in the very narrow application of that definition to enable the CSIS to undertake an investigation.
All right.
I was previously the minister responsible for CSIS. I'm not unfamiliar with the extensive jurisprudence and very high standards that exists for CSIS to take that action.
In the interest of just trying to, I'm hoping to understand your thinking a little bit better, and in the interest of trying to do that in 5 minutes, if you can help us get through this in shorter answers wherever possible, that would be really appreciated. Looking at this definition here, you haven't raised any concerns about espionage, sabotage, foreign interference, or a credible threat to overthrow the government of Canada associated with the protests, have you?
And again, there was some concern, not the activities of a foreign state actor, but that there was some concern about foreign influenced activities detrimental to the interest of Canada. And as well, just to be very clear, I believe there was more than ample evidence in support that the threat or the use of acts of serious violence, and that "or" is rather important. I think very many people felt threatened.
Okay, fair enough. You had outlined several concerns to Commission Council earlier: disruptions to supply chains, impacts on the flow of goods and services, disruptions to transportation, disruptions at the border, etc. These things may be undesirable and they may have an impact on Canadians, but they aren't in and of themselves serious violence, are they?
No, but I think there is an underlying threat of serious violence. Just if I may very quickly give you an example. In our conversations with the police, both the RCMP in Alberta and the Ottawa Police Service here in Ottawa, they were very concerned. And CSIS actually reaffirmed this concern, that any enforcement on their part could result in a violent and provoke a very violent response. I think as well, in all the people that we dealt with in Windsor and in Ottawa, certainly the disruption of critical infrastructure was a very serious issue of national
It's a very serious issue, but it's not serious violence in and of itself. I mean, you spent a lot of time earlier on today speaking to Commission Council about your concerns about the protests, and you outlined concerns like the impact of the disruption to supply chains on Canadians, and you spent quite a bit of time on that. You didn't spend much time identifying any
and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to do so now, sir.
Did you?
I believe that many Canadians experience threats of violence, intimidation, and fear as a result of the activities taking place.
Intimidation and fear aren't in and of themselves.
Let him finish the answer,
well,
then you can.
I mean, in the interest of getting me through this in 5 minutes and giving me a chance to
if you don't let him answer, then there's no point asking the question. So.
True. Intimidation and fear in and of themselves, though, aren't serious violence. I mean, the experience of intimidation and fear, serious violence means something, doesn't it?
Well, in threats of violence, and I think very many people felt very threatened by what was taking place. Quite frankly, intimidation, and a very real apprehension of risk and danger as a result of these activities. I think we heard from very many Canadians who were very sincerely fearful about these things, and we heard from the police who told us that just in the normal, even writing municipal bylaw tickets could precipitate a violent response.
But
and so the police were very fearful of a violent reaction.
But writing municipal bylaw tickets didn't incite a violent response, did it?
Well, again, we were talking about a threat of violence, not just merely the act. You know,
right.
I think it's very clear. Somebody gets
can I just
or something blows up? That's crystal clear. But acts of threats, intimidation, obstruction, all of those things can also be quite violent if they're experienced by Canadians.
There's been a lot said here in the last couple of minutes, and I'm very close to, if not over my time here. But I guess I'd like to ask you. You're making a lot of noise about intimidation and threats of violence, but can you point me to any particular specific threat of violence or event that was violent?
Well, sir, you've characterized my response as noise, but I was trying to answer your question.
Well, I appreciate that, but I'm just trying to cut through this and get an answer out of you.
I can tell you we heard from very many Canadians who were very fearful about the activities of these blockades and protests. You know, they were afraid to walk down their street. They were intimidated and fearful of those reactions. Some of the symbols and other things that were on display were very threatening to very many Canadians. And frankly, the threat of violence is every bit as impactful on a community and on individuals, and therefore it was a very serious matter from my perspective.
All right, the definition in Section 2 of the CSIS Act of a threat to the security of Canada doesn't capture everything that you in your capacity as a Minister of Emergency Preparedness would consider to be a threat to the security of Canada, does it?
I'm not sure what you mean. I think this definition is fairly comprehensive and includes the type of behaviors that I've referred to.
But you would say that in your occupation as Minister of Emergency Preparedness, this sets the limit of what you would consider to be a threat to the security of Canada, Section 2 of the CSIS Act?
I think this defines what, in my opinion, would be a public order threat to the security of Canada. There can be other types of threats that were not necessarily evident here. A cyber attack, for example, that's targeted at critical infrastructure that shuts off a pipeline or a power grid or a water treatment plant. Those can also manifest themselves as threats. There is a significant threat there that doesn't necessarily involve physical violence in the first instance.
Okay. And just a final question. It's your belief that this definition here in Section 2 of the CSIS Act applies differently to CSIS than it does in the context of the Emergencies Act, right?
I'm aware in the way in which this definition applies to CSIS's authority as determined by the courts to initiate an investigation. But I also believe that in its reference in the Emergencies Act, that this it needs to be looked at in a broader context than simply whether or not CSIS could go get a wiretap, for example. And there is, I think, very useful guidance here.
So the Emergencies Act uses a different definition of a threat to the security of Canada.
No, I think this definition as provided within the Act, in my opinion, is appropriate and does, in fact, identify the events and the circumstances that we have described as a concern within the Act as, in fact, a threat to the security of Canada.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you.